Hello. All right. Okay. It's a little past birthday time, but we'll just get started. Today's programming lecture is not too long. We're just going to be going over one topic, CSS animations. But before that, we have some announcements. Hold on. Homework 5 should be turned in by now. And homework 6 will be released today. And again, as always, due before next week's lecture. And then lab 5, which we released last Monday, will be due the following Monday, the 11th. And that also coincides with the midterm project. So if you haven't gotten checked off, a little too late, but if you need any help with coding your midterm project, feel free to reach out on Ed, hop in any of our office hours, and we'll be happy to help you get along that. So you have a little less than a week to do that. Yeah, looking forward to seeing everyone's projects. Okay, so going back to CSS animations, pretty much what we know so far, we're able to create the structure of a website. We're able to style it. We're also able to add hover effects, right? So we have a tiny bit of user interactivity, but for the most part, our websites are pretty static, kind of lifeless, right? But hopefully after today, we'll learn something that can bring a lot more life and motion to our websites. And as you can see here in this diagram, this example website makes use of a lot of animations in pretty much every corner possible, right? The colors here, right? Even something as simple as just these bubbles kind of moving around might not be super noticeable or obvious, but things like that go a long way to give your websites a lot more like identity, which again, this website also kind of exemplifies. And yeah. So before we get started into seeing what it looks like to code up animations, I want to introduce this framework of thinking. So an animation can be thought of as three things: the starting state, ending state, and everything in between, right? And so it seems obvious, seems simple, but it makes your lives a lot easier if you can break down your tasks into just identifying those three things, right? And so for now, we'll just look at the starting and ending state and how to write that up. So I'm going to introduce some new syntax here. This is all done in CSS, so don't write any of this in HTML. This lives only in your CSS file. But oh, shoot. Okay. And so this syntax might look very familiar, where we have some name here and then the curly braces and then rules in the middle. But I just want to make a big distinction here. This is very different from selectors, where you specify like the tag or the class or the ID, and then you mess with some attributes like the border or the background color. It looks very similar, but very different. First thing is, syntactically, we need to specify at keyframes. And so what this is telling CSS is, I'm going to create some sort of animation that will be used for later, not right now, but maybe somewhere in the future, some other selector will reference me and apply the rules that I'm about to define. So we write at keyframes to say all of that. Name is just anything you want to name it. It should correspond to what your animation does. Maybe if you want your animation to move something up and down, you'll call it up and down, right? It doesn't really matter, but it's more so for you to know what it does. And then within rules, this is kind of where we specify those things from earlier, right? The start state, that end state. That's all we're doing here. So before I get into what an example actually looks like, maybe let's think about an animation that causes some HTML elements, some image maybe, to fade in, right? So it's not there, and then slowly it goes into view, right? So we know our start state should be not visible, and then our end state is visible, right? So what CSS attribute might we use? What CSS attribute have we seen that affects the visibility of an element? Yes. Opacity, exactly. So if our start state is not visible, what will we set our opacity to? 0, exactly. And then, of course, when we want it to become visible, we want it to be opacity 1. So what does that look like? Just like before, we have our name, right? So keyframes, at keyframes, this will never change. But we want to name something appropriate, fade in. And notice here, we're defining our start and our end state as from, and then some curly braces, whatever rule we want to start at, and then to, and then our end state. So in English, that just means we want to go from opacity 0 to opacity 1. And when we call this, or when we reference this animation, it should fade in our objects. Now, we don't just have from and to. If we want to get a little more specific, let's say we want to specify some states in the middle, well, we can use percentages to do that, to get a little more granular. So a percentage in this context is not like a hard-coded value. It's really just, if you imagine the animation completing from 0% to 100%, of course, stopping by 1, 2, 3, 4, 50, everything in between, right? If we want to go from one state to another and then another, well, we can specify that with 0, 50, and 100, telling us at 0%, we want basically the from, right? We're starting at opacity 0, and then halfway through, we want opacity 1, and then all the way through opacity 0. So as the name suggests, this is different from our last function. This will actually, sorry, last animation. This will start from not visible to visible and then end invisible again. Cool. All right, and just another example. Maybe instead of messing with the opacity, maybe we want to change the position. Maybe we want, just like in the previous example of the website, we want to move our object around. So maybe we can do that by using top, which in this case represents the top margin. Up, down. So what does that mean? We start with a top margin of 100 pixels. So that doesn't mean it goes up 100 pixels. It actually starts 100 pixels lower than where it should be, because top represents that space from the top. And then halfway through, it comes up. And then at the very end, we put that top 100 pixels again. So that's kind of how we would interpret something like this. It would start low, come back up, and then go back down. Now, we haven't talked about anything about the in-between. We were only looking at very like pictures almost, right? Static states. And how might that be applied? Well, that last animation we just talked about, that up, down, maybe this is the start state, right? And then, sorry, I can't see this, but maybe this is the middle state at 50%. And then, of course, the end state. And we end up something like this that kind of goes back and forth. Yeah. Again, don't worry about the whole like, oh, how do I get the shapes to rotate? Not super important. We're just kind of looking this in that original framework of states. Okay, so let's see how this might be applied. So this is the same thing we just defined earlier, right? But how do we reference it, right? Alone, it doesn't actually mean anything to define your animation. We actually have to specify it in some selector. And so let's say in our HTML, we have some element with the ID potato head. Right? So we've seen this before, right? We use the hashtag or pound sign to specify an element with a certain ID, right? Within our curly braces, now we could talk about the background color. We could talk about the width. But in this case, we want to animate it. So what we'll do is we'll specify two things. At the bare minimum, we need to specify the name of the animation we want to be applied, and also how long do we want that animation to take to complete, right? So the name here, let's say you had multiple animations living in your CSS file. Well, we want to apply up, down. So we'll just say, you'll just copy the name over. And then let's say you want this to occur over half a second. So pretty quick, right? Then it'll go up, down in half a second. So that is the bare minimum we need if we want an animation to appear when we load our website. As we'll see in future slides, or actually in the next few slides, there's a lot more that we can specify. So bare minimum, specify the name, specify how long you want it to take, right? And that is what lives in the selector. The actual rules, again, lives in the definition elsewhere. Okay, just covered that. And so this is a lot, right? But there's a lot more optional adjustments that we can apply. The first one we'll look at is what we'll call the speed curve or the timing function. If you don't specify by default, your animation will just kind of progress linearly, right? But maybe we want, for some application, we want it to kind of start slow and then speed up, right? Or maybe we want it to start fast and then slow down, right? So we have built-in timing functions to express that and communicate that. So we have ease in here, but as we'll see here, there's a lot more. Yeah, and so you can think of one axis as time and the other one as speed, right? As time progresses, maybe the speed increases. Maybe as time increases, the speed actually levels off here. You can get really specific. I know a lot of them look really similar, but if for some reason you want to get that specific, the options are there for you. So next optional adjustment is the delay. By default, your animation will just play as soon as your website loads. Might not be good if you want your user to scroll down first and then see it, right? Because if you have a long web page, your animation's at the bottom, it's just going to play. Your user will never see it, right? And so maybe you'll apply a delay to it. In this case, 0 seconds just means it'll just start playing. It's the same as not specifying it at all. But if you wanted to wait maybe 3 seconds and then play it, then this is the place to specify that. Next one is how many times you want it to play. And I keep referencing this by default. By default means you didn't write this, right? By default, it would just play once, one and done. That's it. But maybe you want to play 3 times, 5 times, 10 times. This is where you specify it. You don't have to just use numbers. There's also a few built-in ones. I think the most common one to use here is infinite. Maybe you want your animation to loop just over and over. You put infinite here, and then it would never stop running. And lastly, the direction. This one might take a bit of time to get used to, but this will tell the animation, am I going from beginning to end by default, right? The 0 to 50 to 100, maybe the from to the to, or do I want to go backwards? If you want to go backwards, you'd put reverse. If you wanted to, maybe you want something to go left, hit a wall, and then bounce back and then go again, then we have one for that called alternate, where you go from the start state to the end state, and then you alternate, right? So then you go from the end state to the start state. And then if you have an infinite animation iteration count, it would just bounce forever, right? So I'm just kind of listing examples and applications in which you might use that. But again, to truly get an intuition for this last one, I think you just have to play around with it in maybe some like JavaScript thing. But we'll take a look at that in just a sec. We'll have a demo at the end where we can kind of test some of our ideas. Okay. And as always with CSS, they always like doing this. Anytime you have some sort of like general thing that you want to do with a lot of attributes, like we just saw a lot of adjustments, shorthand is instead of saying animation name, animation duration, like all of that, you can just say animation and then list these. Convention though, there is an order to it. You have to specify the name, durations, like all of this in order. This might be a pain if you only want to specify these two, because you have to write like, I don't know, linear, 0 seconds, 1, right? You have to specify all the default values if you wanted to use a shorthand. So use it if you want, not mandatory. Last thing that we didn't cover that is actually excluded from this shorthand is the fill mode. Fill mode doesn't really accurately capture what it does, but essentially if you wanted to stop in a certain state after doing a bunch of stuff, this is where you specify that. Maybe you want to bounce back and forth, and then at the end of all it, just stop in the middle. Well, then maybe you can specify that here. And also in the future, when you do want to look back at these slides, this link here, this try it out, will take you to documentation on each of these attributes where you can get a little more information. And so just a clarification and to make this distinction clear, what we've seen so far are pseudo selectors, which respond to some sort of user action. maybe hover, maybe actually just hover, right? You hover over something and then you apply some attribute. Animations are different in that they just kind of run on their own, regardless of user behavior. And yeah, does not depend on any user states. And you have a lot more control over it. Okay. And now the final thing we have for this is our demo. This is going to be a little tricky. Okay. So in this example, we have two things. We have the pumpkin and we have its shadow as defined. It's really hard to see. I'm sorry. Oh, here, right? We have some pumpkin, we have some shadow. Otherwise, we're not really using our HTML at all. So let's just kind of not look at that anymore. So we have two animations here. We have bounce. Remember our structure, right? At keyframes, I'll zoom in. Bounce, we specify our starting position. We specify our ending position. In this case, we're not using opacity or top. Instead, we're using translate Y. This essentially tells you like along the y-axis, where is my thing going to be? Negative 200 actually pushes it up 200 pixels. I know that's like counterintuitive. So just think it starts 200 up and then translate Y brings it down 30. So that's kind of what we have. We just have our starting state and our ending state. By itself, that doesn't really make anything bounce. It just causes it to start from the top and end at the bottom. So if we see what happens when we do this, so no animations, right? We just defined it, but we don't actually have anything because I just commented it. Oh, what did I just do? Okay, so nothing's going on yet, right? Because we haven't actually called it. So if I don't want to use the shorthand and I want to start from the ground up, I'll start by specifying, hey, I want my pumpkin to bounce. So why don't I just use this, right? What do we expect to happen? Nothing. Why? Because what are we missing? The duration. Let's have this occur over 2 seconds. What happened there? That's not really good either, right? We just saw it fall really slowly and then reset up there. Not what we want. Well, maybe we can start by making it go faster. Which we won't see because it already ran. I'll refresh it again. Okay, better. That's like closer to reality if you were to drop a pumpkin, I suppose. But that still wasn't that great. We wanted to go up and down, and we want this to play over and over. So why don't I first do this? Specify, I'm sorry, you can't really see, animation iteration count, which tells us how many times do you want this to go. Let's just have it go a bunch of times. Okay, closer, but that's not what pumpkins do, right? They don't like reappear at the top. So why don't we have it bounce by talking about the animation direction? Okay, better, right? So now it's like not disappearing and reappearing, closer to what we want, but still not exactly right. I'm not sure if you guys remember seeing the original animation, but gravity doesn't really look like that. Right? It doesn't like speed up as it goes up. In fact, if anything, it's reversed. So why don't we talk about our timing function? This will tell us the in-between motion. What do I want that to look like? How do I want the speed to change as the animation progresses? Why don't we call ease in? Yes, so ignore the fact that the pumpkin's bouncing and just appreciate the fact that we were able to recreate the physics of it by breaking down each component, right? And so we called, as a recap, right? We called the function, sorry, we referenced the animation, right? We specified how long do we want this to go, right? If I said 5 seconds, wow, that's too slow. So we want it to be a certain speed, okay? We want this to repeat over and over. If you wanted it just to be some finite number, just specify that finite number. We wanted it to go back and forth. So what does that mean in this case? We want it to go the from state to the to state back to the from state, and so on and so forth, right? And then lastly, just to get the motion a little more realistic, we applied our timing function. And so each of those components together will create this. And of course, the shadow, we can do the same thing, but we'll just match it with the pumpkin. Let's refresh that. Okay, I did something. I broke something. Okay, and so now when we uncomment the other one, yay, now they're in sync. Okay, I'm not going to go over this one just because it's kind of just going over the same stuff that we did with the pumpkin. But at this point, I will open it up to questions. If you're curious about how any of these might affect the animation if we change the value, this is your time to just throw out an idea, and I'll type it in and we'll see. Anyone curious what happens when I put a 0 here? I am. Okay, cool. All right, and that is the end of our programming lecture. Let me see. Yeah. Okay, cool. No other questions. We will move on to the design side. I will pass this off to Grace. Oh, I did not set up the mic. Probably.
Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay.
I broke something.
You know, if I can put in tabs. I go back.
Tabs? Yeah, but you just won't be able to see them very well.
Mm.
Oh, shoot. We have to restart this. Technical difficulties.